That's all. I think that's all of the housekeeping. So my name's Elena Jane. I'm the Director of Scottish Health Action on Alcohol Problems. We host these occasionals jointly with SARN, the Scottish Alcohol Research Network, and both co-chairs of that are here today. That's Professor Carol Emsley of GCU and Professor Aisha Holloway of Edinburgh University. So we're delighted to host this. It's the first in our series, and it's really all about recovery and what we the theme of this year is about what we want to do in terms of reducing alcohol harms in the face of recovery from the COVID pandemic and in the cost of living crisis. So it's very exciting that today we've got, as I say, previously unpublished research, which will be focusing on marketing. This is going to be delivered today by Dr Elena Dimova. Elena is a lecturer in alcohol and drug studies at the University of West of Scotland. She was involved in this research when she was at Glasgow Caledonian University as part of the qualitative work package that was led by Professor Carol Emsley, and the whole project was actually led by Professor Niamh Short at the University of Edinburgh. And research was funded by the ESRC. So I think that's it in terms of housekeeping and introductions. So now if I can just hand straight over to you, Elena, and you can see if you can share your presentation. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Hoping you can see my slides now. Just double checking, can see everything? Perfect. Well, thank you everyone for joining this seminar today. I'll be talking about the findings of a qualitative study we did looking at alcohol availability in Scotland and what key experts think about policy considerations to address availability. And this is part of a bigger study which looked at changes in alcohol and tobacco availability over time, how they link to population health, and how people experience their alcohol and tobacco availability in their environment. And just to briefly say, we have no conflict of interest to declare, and the study was funded by the ESRC. So today I'm going to very briefly talk about alcohol availability more generally and why it matters. And then I'll introduce the bigger study that the specific study I'll be talking about was part of. And the bulk of my talk today will focus on alcohol availability in Scotland and what key experts think are the key considerations for addressing that. And we'll have plenty of time for questions and answers. So looking at alcohol availability more generally, when we talk about alcohol availability, we talk about the physical availability of alcohol and the ease or convenience for buying alcohol. And alcohol is becoming more and more widely available. There are a lot of places in Scotland where one can buy alcohol. And availability often refers to spatial availability. So this is the number of places selling alcohol in a specific area or a specific neighborhood. So thinking about shops or supermarkets or bars and pubs. But we also talk about temporal availability as well, which is the types of sale for alcohol. So how long are premises open for? And there is international research that shows a link between increased availability of alcohol, increased alcohol use, and increased health outcomes, such as health harms, injuries, crimes, and violence. So basically, the easier it is to buy alcohol, the more people drink and the more harms they experience. One example of this is from Sweden. When alcohol-only shops opened on a Saturday, they recorded high increase of sales for alcohol. Similarly, looking at studies from Canada and Australia, in neighborhoods where there are a lot of places selling alcohol, there is higher rates of mortality, alcohol-specific mortality and morbidity. And also we see higher rates of crime and violence in neighborhoods where there are a lot of bars and pubs that are quite close to each other. One example closer to home from Scotland was a study done a few years ago that looked at the retail availability of alcohol and its relationship with behaviours, health outcomes, and also inequalities in Scotland. And it found that alcohol-related death rates were higher in neighbourhoods where there were more places selling alcohol compared to places where there's fewer outlets selling alcohol. Similarly, there were higher alcohol-related hospitalizations in these areas as well, and 4 times higher rates of crime. So this shows a very clear relationship that between availability and related harms. And there have been different explanations as why high alcohol availability might be linked to health harms. And there are 3 potential pathways that can explain this relationship. The first one focuses on increased exposure to alcohol products. So basically, the more shops or the more places selling alcohol, the higher the exposure to alcohol products is. So people see alcohol products on shop windows, for example, or promotions inside venues. And the more people exposed to alcohol advertising, the higher the rates of alcohol consumption. And even looking at qualitative studies that talk to young people talk about walking to school, for example, and seeing alcohol products in shops or seeing people queuing outside of pubs. And this reminds them that alcohol is easily available in their neighborhood. A second explanation is in relation to retail competition. So when there are a lot of places in a neighborhood selling alcohol, they might start competing with each other and lowering prices. So then price is not a barrier for people to buy and consume alcohol. And the final explanation focuses on permissive norms. The more there are places selling alcohol in a specific community, then it's perceived as more common to consume alcohol, and it's perceived to be socially endorsed. So in some of these situations, alcohol use becomes normalized. And sometimes they might even be perceived peer pressure to drink because it is so normalized. And the World Health Organization recommends reducing availability as a cost-effective best buy intervention. And they recommend that countries restrict availability in terms of reducing the times of sale for alcohol, but also reducing the number of places selling alcohol in specific areas. And the other best buy interventions recommended by the World Health Organization are to focus on affordability of alcohol, so increasing the price and reducing the advertising of alcohol. Although for the purposes of today's talk, I'll be talking about availability specifically. So why does alcohol availability matter for local populations? First of all, looking at Scotland, there are over 17,000 places to buy alcohol. And we see a social gradient in alcohol off sales as well. So we see higher densities in deprived areas and to lower densities in the most affluent neighbourhoods in Scotland. And in addition to this, we see clustering of outlets selling unhealthy products. So it's not only the alcohol outlets, we also see outlets selling tobacco, fast food, and also gambling outlets that all cluster in deprived areas. And one example focusing on children and their exposure to alcohol and other unhealthy commodities as well. There was a study done a few years ago looking at children living in the most deprived areas in Scotland, and it found that children living in deprived areas were almost 5 times more likely to be exposed to shops selling alcohol in their neighbourhood, and almost 3 times more likely to be exposed to bars and pubs in their neighbourhood. And in addition to this, about 1/3 of children's exposure to these outlets actually happened within 500 meters of their home. And this is for children living in deprived areas, compared to only 7% for children living in less deprived or more affluent areas. From a qualitative perspective, looking at children's views on their exposure to alcohol and their environment, the Children's Parliament and Alcohol Focus Scotland did a study a few years ago, and they talked to children between the ages of 9 and 11 years old They used a giant clock to talk to children about alcohol exposure throughout their day and to where they see alcohol. And basically, the children said they see alcohol everywhere and it's all around them. And some of them were concerned about safety. They talked about pubs being open when they were walking to school, and they felt scared because they were walking past drunk people. They also talked about exposure to alcohol in the park, when bins have been turned upside down and there are empty bottles and rubbish all over the ground. So this came out very strongly in this report that the children didn't want to be exposed to alcohol so much in their environment. But there are other groups within the population as well that the environment can become quite risky for. And one example is people recovering from alcohol dependence. So in a study led by Professor Short, they talked to people recovering from alcohol dependence. And these people found it really hard to navigate their environment in their neighborhood because they were exposed to alcohol everywhere. And they talked about corner shops, chip shops, wedding, golf clubs, and how hard it was for them to keep to their goals in terms of their recovery. And one participant said, it's just there, right on my doorstep, and the first sign is beers and ciders. So given the relationship between alcohol availability, alcohol use, and harms, especially in deprived areas, it's really important to examine how alcohol availability changes over time, but also how it's linked to population health and how people experience alcohol availability in their neighborhoods. And this 3-year mixed method study looked exactly at that and includes 3 separate work packages. The first 2 work packages are quantitative, and they look at the relationship between change in alcohol and tobacco availability in Scotland across time and how they link to population health. And we see similar patterns in relation to tobacco availability as well, increased availability linked to harms. And this is the first study to look at both commodities, both at alcohol and tobacco as well, although I'll be talking about alcohol today. And most relevant to this talk today is work package 3, which is a qualitative package. And this looks at people's perceptions of alcohol availability in their environment and people's perceptions about ways to address alcohol availability in Scotland, and also key experts' views on how to address alcohol availability in Scotland. And today I'm going to talk about the interviews with the key experts, although towards the end of my talk, I will briefly mention the focus groups with members of the public in Scotland. So we had 4 overarching questions we wanted to answer. The first one was, what do experts perceive to be the policy priorities in relation to alcohol availability in Scotland? The second, we looked at the place of availability compared to affordability and attractiveness in alcohol policy in Scotland. So thinking about the 3 of these being the 3 most cost-effective interventions recommended by the World Health Organization. We talked about potential policies to reduce inequalities and support vulnerable populations. And finally, we talked about experts' experiences in gaining support for different policies. We did semi-structured interviews, and we spoke to 14 experts from third sector organizations, including organizations working in alcohol and or tobacco, policy, public health, and alcohol licensing. And the time and current role varied from 4 months to very experienced experts in the field, 17 years. And we used thematic analysis to analyze that. So the findings focused on the place of availability in the policy context, policy priorities for addressing availability, addressing alcohol-related health inequalities, and policy support and conflict of interest. And I'll focus on these just now. So first of all, we talked about the place of availability in the policy context, and we asked experts to think where availability is in the policy context compared to marketing and promotions. And there was a common perception among all experts that there are a lot of places to buy alcohol in Scotland. As this quote illustrates, there is just a sheer volume of locations that you can purchase alcohol or tobacco, and usually they're the same place. And experts talked about the relationship between availability, price, and marketing, and highlighted the three are actually quite closely linked and they're interdependent on each other. Like this expert here from a third sector organization, for example, said, one of the gaps is probably a lack of understanding of how availability influences exposure to marketing, sponsorship, promotion. Availability has a really fundamental role to play in that. And given these interdependencies, key experts reflected on the best way to address this. Some of them felt that it is possible to address all three of these in an all-encompassing piece of legislation. For example, this policymaker said, it's a real interplay around different parts of policies, around price, around availability, marketing, advertising, all of them, and how they all interlink. It's not just a case of doing one thing, it's how you address it across the piece. But then there are other experts who say that addressing everything in one piece of legislation may not be realistic, and it makes more sense to have one policy implemented, then evaluated, and then using that evidence to demonstrate positive impact on health outcomes before then making a case for implementing another policy later on. And experts reflected on changes in policies in relation to both tobacco and alcohol, and they often compare the two. And they say that there have been so many policy developments in Scotland in relation to addressing tobacco harms that a lot can be learned from this and applied to alcohol. And for example, this member of a third sector organization said, there are more significant gaps in health policies in alcohol than there are in tobacco. And experts reflected on the change over time, not only policies in tobacco control, but how these policies contributed to changing perceptions towards smoking in Scotland. And they reflected whether we can change perceptions towards alcohol as well. For example, this quote here says, if you think about the smoking ban in Scotland, and this refers to banning smoking in indoor places in Scotland, what the ban did was it denormalized smoking in areas that people attend. So imagine if you went to a supermarket that didn't sell alcohol. It denormalizes that. I've just walked up 15 aisles and I got to the end and, oh, there's a bottle of wine for $5.99. I'll just check that in my basket. So the expert reflected on that, whether we can achieve the same and change perceptions towards alcohol the same way it was done in relation to smoking in Scotland. But some of them acknowledge that the policy context is very different and the approach needs to be different as well. And for example, this quote illustrates this by saying, alcohol to some extent is a different kettle of fish in the sense that cultural elements of tobacco are different to the cultural elements of alcohol. Alcohol is significantly further behind in terms of how people view it as a health-harming commodity. People generally view alcohol as fun, in the same way that tobacco was cool 50 years ago. And experts talked about the retail landscape in relation to alcohol changing over time. And some of them talked about perceptions that alcohol is just physically available. People go to their local shop and they buy alcohol. And they were saying this perception is not valid anymore because the retail landscape has changed. And it's changed especially during the COVID-19 pandemic, which accelerated the move towards online availability and online purchasing of alcohol. And they talked about buying alcohol from online websites, but also delivery companies and being able to order alcohol from your local shop or from your local pub or bar and having alcohol delivered. And this shift from physical availability to online availability is something the key experts talked quite a lot about. Although the focus of the study was to talk about physical availability, this kept coming up in conversations. And the challenges presented from online availability were discussed by the third sector organization representatives, but also by policymakers as well. So for example, one person from a third sector organization said, there is a risk that if you restrict availability in real life, then online availability may see proliferation. I think there needs to be something done potentially at the same time online. And policymakers said that this is really difficult. With this one said, one issue that gives me a little bit of a headache is the challenge around online sales because of the difficulties that are associated with that. So this presented new challenges in terms of how to address online availability through policies. And thinking about addressing availability, we talked about the different ways this can be done in Scotland, and we focused primarily on physical availability rather than online availability in these discussions. And policymakers and third sector organisations felt that there is a need for a national approach to addressing alcohol availability. And they often referred to the Scottish Parliament's powers in addressing this. And for those of you who are not familiar, the way the UK Parliament and the Scottish Parliament works is that the Scottish Parliament has some powers to implement policies independently of the UK government, although there are some areas where the powers are reserved to the UK government, so the Scottish Parliament can't implement policies. But the experts in our sample felt that availability is the one specific area where the Scottish Parliament has powers and can do something about, unlike other areas such as advertising and pricing, which are more complicated. And this quote illustrates this. Out of marketing and price promotion, availability is probably the policy area that's wholly devolved to the Scottish Parliament. Said this, key experts had concerns that a national approach to addressing alcohol availability may change depending on the changing political landscape and the priorities of the government. So this quote illustrates this. The people who would have driven getting the policy to the legislative phase are no longer there. You have changes in government. The new Minister for Health comes in and goes, well, that's yesterday's problem. That's the political reality of the work. And this is particularly relevant to Scotland at the moment, given we have a new First Minister and we don't know where the priorities in terms of addressing alcohol-related harms will be. So the key experts talked about a national approach to addressing alcohol availability, but they also felt that a national approach needs to be adaptable to reflect the local context and the local needs of different communities. And they say that different communities within Scotland experience difficult issues in relation to alcohol availability. And they say that you want decisions to be taken at a local level because they should be responsive to local circumstances and local needs. And to give an example of this, they talked about areas of multiple deprivation. They also talked about areas that are quite remote and rural communities in Scotland, so smaller communities. And the key experts felt that one size doesn't fit all because different areas experience different issues. One example was given from rural areas up north in Scotland. And the key experts say that in these areas, there are places such as post offices, for example, or petrol stations that are not economically sustainable by not selling alcohol. So in order not to close down, a lot of these places apply for an alcohol license to sell alcohol. And a member of our alcohol licensing team said that in some rural areas up north in Scotland, alcohol would be what justifies and supports and sustains small local businesses and enables them to survive. Probably more difficult to run that argument in Glasgow, which is a big city. So there is that comparison here that sometimes post offices and petrol stations and other outlets might need to sell alcohol in remote areas in order to be economically viable, which doesn't need to be the case for bigger cities where we see more of these outlets, and how a national approach couldn't be applicable to small areas and big areas. So it needs to be able to be adapted to represent these, to adapt for these local needs. And the experts talked about areas of multiple deprivation as well, and they acknowledged there are more outlets selling alcohol and other unhealthy commodities in areas of multiple deprivation, and how this makes it really hard for people living in these areas because it creates an unhealthy environment that drives people towards unhealthy choices. Like the second quote, he illustrates this. We do have a choice, but we also live in a world where our choices are heavily dictated to us quite often. And if you live in an area of multiple deprivation, and you have to walk past 5 fast food places and 3 places that are selling tobacco to get to the gym, you're probably not going to make it to the gym. So experts talk about that need to address alcohol outlet density in areas of multiple deprivation and how we need to create environments that help people make healthy choices. But then they talked about a complicated decision-making process of looking at places in deprived areas. So for example, one person working in alcohol licensing said, let's say a deprived area is crying out for a supermarket. You would struggle to find a supermarket that say they would open without an alcohol license because it is about providing the full service. So this is an opportunity to bring fresh fruit and vegetables, bakery provisions at much more accessible pricing to an area that doesn't currently have that service. There is a lot of positives, job creation, and it comes with alcohol. And it's very difficult in those situations for the alcohol licensing boards to look at grounds for refusal when the benefits probably outweigh the potential for health-related harms. And just to say here that in Scotland, there's alcohol licensing boards in different areas. And these are the boards that can grant or refuse an alcohol license. And outlets need to apply for an alcohol license before they can sell alcohol. And members of alcohol licensing teams talked about these complicated decisions they have to make, and they have to weigh the potential public health benefits of a supermarket with the potential cost of harms in relation to alcohol if a shop is to open. And it wasn't a straightforward process to make these decisions. One thing that came out quite strongly in the interviews was, despite this complicated decision-making process, it's really important to protect children. And the key experts believe that children have rights to be protected from harms. And they talked about the changing retailing landscape in different areas, but also the changing attitudes towards alcohol and how children are the adults of the future. So there must be a way to address how they look at alcohol, because then that takes us through into how they're then approaching alcohol as adults and into the wider long-term use. And again, they drew parallels here with smoking and how attitudes towards smoking changed over the years. It was really important for the experts in our study that children's exposure to alcohol is reduced. And they talked about different ways to reduce exposure to alcohol. They talked about reducing advertising, for example, and making sure that places children go to don't have alcohol adverts. But in relation to alcohol availability, they talked about local stores, and there are local mixed grocery shops in Scotland, so you can buy things such as milk and bread, but you can also buy alcohol as well. And this person from a third sector organisation said, kids that go to these mixed grocery shops from the school to get their lunch, and the way the queuing system works is you queue around the alcohol aisle. That seems a bit too much for me in terms of availability. It shows these kids where they can get alcohol. They probably become familiar with the brands. And this is something that was mentioned by other experts as well, that usually there is a shop near school so children can go and get their lunch. But when you look at smaller shops, convenience stores, usually there is an aisle where alcohol is very visible, and children have to stand next to the alcohol while queuing to buy their lunch, and they become familiar with the different brands. So here again, the experts talked about the relationship between advertising and availability and how children are exposed to alcohol just because their shops are available and there's alcohol available in these shops. And the final theme focused around policy support from policymakers. And we asked key experts about their experiences for gaining policy support from policymakers as well, and how policies can be implemented. And they talked about the importance of research evidence. They talked about the importance of the communities being involved in the policy discussions, and also about the role of retailers in policy discussions as well. So first of all, policymakers were very clear that there is a need for a strong evidence base, and there has to be research and evidence to suggest that a potential policy would be effective and would affect alcohol use and related harms. So this policymaker said, if we're looking at any policy changes at some future point, on what grounds? Where is the justification for change? What does the data that's available actually tell us to help inform that policymaking decision? And members of third sector organizations that we spoke to talked about the importance of public support. So many of them believed that policymakers are convinced by public opinions. So it's important to get the public on board when communicating with policymakers. So for example, this key expert said, I think just raising awareness, being in the media, talking to people, that's how policymakers are persuaded by public opinion. If you can win the public over, then you're on your way to a more successful policy approach than if you're just focusing on the policymakers themselves. And some key experts actually say that policymakers often want to see the personal story behind the numbers. So a combination of research evidence and personal stories might be particularly effective in influencing policy decisions and convincing policymakers that a specific policy needs to be considered and implemented. Looking at key experts' views on whether the retail sector should be involved in policy discussions, virtually all of the participants say that the retailers represent the alcohol industry and that they have vested interests and a lot of implicit power. So they shouldn't be involved in policy formulation. So the first quote here says, retailers are there to make a profit. They're part of the alcohol industry. My firm view is that no part of the alcohol industry should be a part of the policy formulation because it's a complete conflict of interest. But then there were other people in our sample, other experts who said that there is a difference between the alcohol industry, large supermarkets and small shops. And there's also difference in shops in more deprived areas versus shops in rural areas versus in urban areas. And it's sometimes important to engage with these small retailers and talk to them about the potential ways a specific policy can be implemented, because they're the ones who can advise on barriers to implementing a policy and whether it can actually work in practice. And for example, the second quote says that retailers have a role to play in terms of providing intelligence about the implementation of policy and things like that. They will know how it will work in practice, and they should be involved in those sorts of discussions, but not in terms of setting policy. And I just want to say here that we actually tried to talk to retailers. We contacted a wide range of retailers, but none of them were able to take part. And some of them replied to give a reason, others didn't reply at all. So we couldn't get the retailers' views on this. So just to briefly conclude all of the findings of the studies, the experts talked about the interdependencies between availability, marketing, and price. And they reflected on whether there is a need for individual policies, so a policy to address availability, followed by a policy to address marketing, for example, and being able to demonstrate policy effectiveness before another policy is implemented. Others felt that a potential policy can address all of these three at the same time. And one example of this is the Public Health Alcohol Act in Ireland, that addressed all of these three. So it reduced the visibility of alcohol, it increased the price of alcohol as well, and reduced advertising. And some of the experts, they talk about Ireland as an example of this. Experts talked about changing perceptions towards smoking in Scotland and how drawing on lessons from tobacco control policies can be useful in addressing alcohol availability in Scotland. And this, of course, can provide an opportunity for greater policy coherence across unhealthy commodities, especially knowing that a lot of the unhealthy commodities cluster in areas of multiple deprivation. Online availability came up quite a lot, although we weren't specifically asking about it. And this has been increasing internationally, and especially since the COVID pandemic as well. And the experts talked about challenges around not only understanding online availability and how it works, but then how to address it. So this has implications for research. We need more research and more evidence to understand online availability, and also it needs to be considered in potential future policy discussions. Experts talked about the importance of public support, and it's really important to involve communities in policy discussions and have public support for policies. And they believe that policymakers can be influenced by public decisions and public opinions, but this needs to be supplemented with sufficient evidence to show that potential policies would work. And they talked about the right political climate and how when there is government restructuring or elections or people leave and new policymakers come, then priorities around addressing alcohol harms can change. And virtually all of the experts talked about a need for a national approach to address alcohol availability, but they were clear that this needs to be adaptable to local contexts and local needs, and how urban versus remote areas experience different issues in relation to alcohol availability, and also areas of multiple deprivation as well. It was really important for the experts in our sample for policies to consider the potential impact on children and policies to be able to protect children from alcohol-related harm, and also help children develop more healthy attitudes towards alcohol as they were seen as the adults of the future. Views on managing retailers' involvement in policy discussions were quite similar in terms of not wanting retailers to be involved in setting policy priorities and policy formulation. But some of the experts felt that the retailers can be involved in discussions around policy implementation and how a policy would work in practice. So just before I conclude, I just want to mention the next steps in relation to the bigger study that this qualitative package is part of. The findings I talked about today, we have submitted a paper for publication, so we are hoping that they will be publicly available soon. But also mentioned in the beginning, we have been doing focus groups as part of this qualitative package. And to recruit members of the public for our focus groups, we use trajectories from the quantitative work package 1 as a sampling frame. So work package 1 looked at changes in both alcohol and tobacco availability over time in Scotland. And we use this to map areas in Scotland where availability of alcohol has increased, where availability has decreased, where there has been no change in availability. And we also looked at neighbourhoods that are different in terms of socioeconomic deprivation and their rural versus urban status. So we use this sampling frame to recruit people from different areas in Scotland and talk to them about their neighbourhood. So we asked them about alcohol and tobacco availability in their neighbourhood and how it looks and feels like. We asked them about how they think their neighbourhood has changed over time in terms of availability of alcohol, and how availability might be shaping perceptions in relation to alcohol use in their community. And we also talked to the public about reactions to potential policy interventions to address alcohol-related harms in Scotland. And we developed a list of potential interventions in collaboration with partners. And this is what these interventions look like. So this is the infographic that we have been using in the focus groups, and we've also been showing to key experts as part of the interviews, although I didn't focus on this today. So on the right-hand side, you see different suggestions for policies, and all of these are based on international literature. So we asked both key experts and also the public and people living in different neighbourhoods across Scotland about what they think about restricting alcohol advertising and sponsorship at sporting events and festivals, whether they think that would work, whether they think it's a good idea, and why. We asked them about limiting the number of places which sell alcohol in neighbourhoods where there are already lots of places to buy, so basically areas of high density of alcohol outlets. We asked about their views on whether alcohol should be sold in alcohol-only shops or in one area of a shop where alcohol is hidden by a physical barrier. We asked the public whether they think local communities should be able to influence licensing decisions in their areas. So whether they want to be consulted if a new pub is to open, or if a new shop to sell alcohol is to open, or opening hours and days of sale of alcohol. And finally, we asked them about whether they think the sale of alcohol near schools and play parks should be banned. So we discussed this with people living in different neighbourhoods in Scotland, some neighbourhoods where there is high alcohol availability, some where there is low alcohol availability. And we also asked the key experts on their views on this. So our plan for the next step is to be writing up these findings and writing up papers comparing the key experts and the public views on alcohol availability, but also on tobacco availability as well. And as I mentioned, there was work package 1 and work package 2, which looked at a quantitative relationship between alcohol and tobacco availability over time and population health. So these are 5 overarching topics that we're working on in terms of writing up papers. There's one looking at changes over time in the availability of alcohol and tobacco retailers in Scotland over the period between 2012 and 2020. There is a paper looking at alcohol outlet density in Scotland and how that's associated with changes in alcohol-related mortality. And another paper looking at something similar, but in relation to tobacco availability and relationships with tobacco-related hospitalizations and mortality over the same period of 8 years. There's another paper looking at the association between geographic availability of alcohol and tobacco products and their consumption. And finally, looking at local shifts in alcohol and tobacco retailing and their relationship with deprivation as well. So hopefully there'll be a lot of papers coming over the next year or so based on the overarching, the bigger mixed methods study. Thank you very much for listening. And I think we should have half an hour for questions.
Thanks, Elena. If you'd like to stop sharing your screen now.
Yes, my Zoom has gone a bit weird. I'm just trying to go back into it.
Okay, good luck.
Yeah, that should be it.
Thank you. Okay, I think that was fascinating. Really interesting to get, well, the diversity of views from various different groups through your qualitative research. Also the diversity of views within those groups as well. So policy experts, I guess that's something that I would be particularly interested in. It was really interesting to see sort of different approaches that various different people thought should be taken in relation to taking forward policy change on availability, which I think leads nicely to a little bit of debate that was just starting to get going in the chat, maybe at a more sort of philosophical level, rather than getting down to some of the more specifics in relation to your research. But Sheila Gilhaney and Wim Dunbalen were talking in the chat about research and how valuable research is, how there's so much pressure put on advocacy organisations and others to come up with research to demonstrate the impact of potential policy interventions, but whether this is actually fair. I don't know, Sheila, would you like to expand on that a little bit more? And if you'd like to introduce yourself as well, that would be great.
Hello. Hi, Eleanor. Thank you very much for calling on me there. Yeah, you know, and Wim has made this point very, very well. We have tons of research already that, you know, shows the value of the basic restrictions and the availability on that, and yet industry will always seek to downplay that or say that doesn't apply in our particular area, or this should be different in Ireland or in this particular county, something like that. And I think so just something that really occurs to me is that, not that I want industry to be carrying out research, but you know, for policy making, but they are in possession of huge swathes of data around the location of their sales and the amount of their sales. And that, in fact, actually is a very powerful piece of information that would be useful for licensing requirements. So I'd just be interested to hear, you know, other people's views on things like that.
And Wim, are you still on the call? Because if so, would you like to speak a little bit about your experiences and your views?
Yes.
Thank you. And please introduce yourself.
Sorry, yes. Yeah, well, I agree with Sheila, and we experienced the last 4 or 5 years a kind of debate with industry people, and they always focus on more research, and some research was absolutely useful, but they are never satisfied, and it's the same with politicians. So. But finally, we need research, of course, but I think we have already a lot of research. So they say, well, you need research from your own country, international research is not enough, etc. So, but beside that, what I said also, I think it's also important to listen to people, to interview people, to ask emotional reactions from people about what's happening. I think that's also, it's a growing tool in our country. So we make small videos with people, etc. So that's, beside research, is also necessary, and you have to do it also on a systematic way, of course, those interviews, but it's really important also for all kinds of professionals to see people speaking about these kind of things. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. Elena, was there a consensus amongst anyone in terms of your interviews as to what the most effective way is to make the case for changes in availability or any other policy change?
Yeah, both things that Sheila and Wim were actually saying about are things that resonate with what the people working in alcohol licensing were saying to us. So they were saying, despite clear evidence that increased alcohol availability is linked to harms, when it comes to making decisions about alcohol licensing, we often hear the alcohol industry representatives saying, well, this research is not applicable for this specific area. You can't say that our specific shop is going to increase harms when there are other shops in that area as well. You can't link that. And they did talk about that, the emotional aspect, and how in some cases, it's the emotions that sway the licensing board to reject an application. And there's one example in particular that I can remember. We talked about an area of multiple deprivation in Scotland, and there was a man from the public who went to the licensing board and said, you don't need to look at the research evidence and the data. All you need to do is go to the graveyard and look at the years of people dying. And they were talking about how they know these people, and they were dying young as a result of alcohol-related harm. And the person who spoke to us felt that it was this emotional story that actually swayed it in some cases, and the licensing board might reject an application as a result of hearing personal stories.
That's really interesting, thank you. We've got a question on licensing, but before that, I was wondering if Lauren Carters-White would like to speak to your question about, which is basically another issue that came up in your research, Elena, about views on what's most appropriate or most effective, big policy change or sort of piecemeal step-by-step change. Lauren, would you like to speak about that a little bit and ask your question?
Yeah, thank you. And hi, Elena. That was a fascinating presentation, and I'm really looking forward to the papers coming out. So I was really interested in the experts' sort of views on how to achieve policy change. And I'm reflecting back on just the recent marketing consultation, alcohol marketing consultation that closed. It was a massive consultation in itself, and the size of that received quite a lot of criticism. And I was just looking for your views on, you know, from your research experience and your experience within the policy space, how do you think we should potentially move forward when we think about availability? Do you think like a few big policies are the way forward, or is a more piecemeal approach better, particularly considering the discussions around the cultural relevance of alcohol and the other aspects in your talk? Thank you.
Yeah, that's a really good question, and I'm afraid I don't have a clear answer, given that there are different things being implemented in different countries. And the discussion about the Public Health Act in Ireland specifically was actually quite prominent in some of the conversations we had with key experts, because they were saying it's great to address everything in one piece of legislation, but it's actually really challenging to then implement all of these at different stages. And some of them actually get diluted as well you might aim really high, but that's not always possible to be implemented. And they did reflect, is it better to do what Scotland did and implement, let's say, minimum yet pricing? Obviously, there was a lot of years in between implementing that and first deciding to be implemented, whether it's worth doing this and having one policy, or whether it's better to address all of them and then deal with that over the years. And there isn't a clear answer. I think looking at other countries as well, a stepped approach seems to work, but that's not to say that a bigger approach doesn't work neither. So, yeah.
Yeah, I wonder if, did it come out? Oh, I think your references, Elena, that some people did mention it really matters on the political climate at any one time.
Yeah, they talked about obviously SNP coming into power and not having links with the alcohol industry, and this is why there was a policy window for minimum unit pricing, and whether there would be another policy window for another like a big policy like minimum unit pricing, and we don't know, but yeah, they did reflect on that quite a lot. Yeah,
definitely think we're sort of in a maybe misty window at this point in time in terms of opportunity in Scotland. So thank you very much for that, Lauren. That was really interesting. If we could just turn to licensing then. Matthew Thomas, I believe that you had a question about your experience of licensing boards, if you're still available.
Thanks, Eleanor. Hi, Elena, how are you doing? My experience of working with the ADP in Orkney was that the local licensing board was very creative in the way that it went about rejigging the boundaries of the main centres of population so that they could claim that there was no over provision of alcohol serving premises within the main centres of population in the Orkney Islands. How can we control what local licensing boards are doing if they are going to be this duplicitous in the way that they react, as it were?
Do you have thoughts on that, Elena?
I don't actually know that much about how alcohol licensing boards work. It was discussions we had about the complicated decision-making process, and I know all of them talked about that the process is not always transparent, and there's often representatives from the alcohol industry who have their lawyers and who know the process. So it's sometimes easier for them to influence decisions compared to members of the public who obviously don't have that knowledge or the money to be able to do that. Yeah,
I think you're right. I think there's a number of lawyers who represent the licensed trade in Scotland who will appeal decisions and represent the licensed trade at every sort of part of the decision-making process, which is obviously very effective for them. And something that's always struck me, I mean, I'm certainly no expert in licensing either, but something that has struck me is that once licenses are granted, it's very difficult for them to be removed unless it's a sort of, repeated breaches or whatever. But once you get, you could decide that there's over provision within an area, but you can't take licenses away due to over provision once they've been granted. So that seems a bit of a flaw in our system at this point in time, if you're looking at availability as a public health, as a means to improve public health.
Yeah, same as opening hours as well. They were talking about by default in Scotland, they're just given 10 to 10, like 10 in the morning to 10 at night, still alcohol, when there is scope to actually reflect on this and whether that should be the default option when giving an alcohol license. But it seems to happen that there's nothing more restricted than that usually.
Yeah, okay, thank you. Matthew, you had another question about the Scandinavian approach to the provision of licenses or the availability of alcohol. I don't know if you'd want to just share your thoughts on that, and if there's anybody with direct experience of the Scandinavian model who'd like to just describe what happens in practice, and that would be really helpful.
Yeah, sure. Some of the Scandinavian countries will only allow sale of alcohol off premises in specialised stores, which have set opening hours and usually are located out with main centres of population. Could that be a model that Scotland might look to adapt?
Elena, did that come up much in your interviews?
Key experts mentioned it here and there. It was more discussed with the public, actually, and all I can say is, because we're still analysing that data, is that there were some mixed views. Some people think it's great to do that, others think it's actually imposing on people who drink moderately and who should have their access to alcohol whenever they want. But yeah, as I said, this is just what I remember from the focus groups. We're still analysing the data, and there will be more in relation to that in the future when we're writing up.
And what struck me in some of your presentation was when you were talking about cultural norms with, in terms of views on alcohol, which I do think are shaped by availability, because I'm very conscious that if I was to talk to a policymaker in Scotland about or to advocate for a Scandinavian model, it would just seem so jarring to them, because it's just not something that we find, so I guess, politically or culturally acceptable. Whereas if you speak to our counterparts in another country in Scandinavia, for instance, who've got a very different model, our approach to the provision and availability of alcohol is very jarring to them. So I think it just depends. The availability does genuinely seem to shape your views in terms of norms on alcohol. So I think it is quite a fascinating area. It's all tied in together, isn't it?
It is, and I think that's one of these discussions we had with people when we're developing the policy suggestions as well, is the way forward to suggest something so extreme to policymakers that they're not happy with it, but then when it gets diluted, you still get something that could be implemented and could potentially affect alcohol use and harms just because of these initial reactions. And should you just start at this extreme end to hopefully get something that's acceptable?
Yeah, thank you. Wim, you just put in the chat about speaking to Swedish colleagues. If you just want to if you're still there, if you could just briefly describe that, and then if you would like to speak about your point about people in recovery, then that would also be helpful.
Yes, yeah, there was last week, there was a presentation from people from Sweden about how the NGOs are working together is in fact the shops. That's very interesting. So it's advised, if you're interested in the model, just go look for contact and ask for a presentation. They are willing to do that, I'm sure.
Okay.
About people in recovery, yes, we did a research from people from the Alcohol Anonymous about how they experience marketing and availability, and it was really very interesting how they deal with this with marketing, especially in the first years of absence. It's a huge, how do you say it in English? A huge, difficulty for them to accept, to even for going for a normal shop to a supermarket. It's really because everywhere you see alcohol, not only on specific places, but you see everywhere in the supermarket, you see marketing, etc. So it's very interesting to do a research and to make also people, in general, people who stop with drinking alcohol, to make part of your lobby so that they support your lobby for a better policy. Yes.
So what was that presentation? I think I missed that. Was that a seminar?
Yes, it was a seminar. Yes, the Swedish presented a seminar about Systembolaget. Yes, yeah.
Okay,
you can contact people from IUGT. You know them, I guess.
Yeah, thank you. That's great. Okay, so have you got any thoughts on that, Elena?
No, I just agree with this. We know that people in recovery really struggle in these risky environments, and they often talk about having to pre-plan their route and where to go and the way to walk just to avoid alcohol. And it's just scary to think about that anyone has to plan it so carefully to avoid alcohol.
It does, especially if you think about a rights-based approach to health. Why certain groups have to be discriminated against to be able to protect their own health. It seems to conflict with that. I wonder if Gareth Hollins is still here and would like to speak about his point around availability within a store, which then does relate to what we were just talking about there as well.
Yeah, hi, Gareth Hollins, UCL. Yeah, thanks for that. That was extremely interesting talk. So basically, my question was just around where we might think that sort of within retail outlet level availability, so kind of, you know, more micro scale, so not about kind of temporal availability or restrictions at sort of more macro level, how that might fit in. Because I don't think it's, as was apparent, and we've had a bit of email correspondence about this, it's not really, doesn't seem to really be in the minds of retail, policymakers and decision makers. But, you know, there's some emerging evidence about the importance of this, so sort of shifting around the availability of non-alcoholic versus alcoholic options in retail settings. I had the liberty of posting a trial we just published in the chat about this, if you don't mind. So yeah, I was just wondering if any thoughts about that, anything that came up in the discussions would be really interesting to hear about.
Yeah, it's funnily enough, that wasn't mentioned by the experts at all. None of them talked about no booze or no alcohol products. It did come up in the focus groups again, for my recollections of the focus groups, but it did come up in more affluent areas, and they were talking about trendy pubs and trendy bars and how there is link. And someone mentioned Panther milk, which I hadn't heard of until then.
No.
But supposedly it's a vegan alcoholic drink, so obviously that has alcohol, but it does have the appeal as like it's going to a specific group. And then no and low alcohol options are linked to these trendy perceptions and what areas they're sold in. But again, people talked about, you know, cost effectiveness and how non-alcoholic drinks cost the same as an alcoholic drink, so you know you don't get the same amount for your money basically, and they were reflecting on these perceptions as well.
Yeah, interesting. I'm just, do you have any sense of why this kind of that sort of aspect of availability, it doesn't seem to be in decision makers' minds at all? And is it just, I guess, historical, more focus on restrictions and spatial availability? Anyway, yeah.
Yeah, I don't actually know how that works and why places don't necessarily stock this, or whether that would be something they would sell, and why policymakers don't focus on. I suppose if you're promoting no and low alcohol, the alcohol industry is still making a profit.
Yeah,
so
yeah,
makes sense. Yeah.
Yeah. Thanks very much.
Yeah.
Thank you.
I know in Scotland there are some restrictions around sort of display of alcohol within stores, and in the recent marketing consultation that Lauren mentioned in her question, there was further restrictions were proposed, or as an option within that consultation, to have similar to what's happened in Ireland, where there'll be specific areas where you have to go through a physical barrier to be able to go into that area of a supermarket to buy alcohol. So it's out there a wee bit, but it's not a massive topic of debate, it's got to be said.
Although thinking about this, I actually included a picture in my presentation that when I went to Ireland, I was very excited to see these barriers in shops, and then I noticed that on them they actually say things like, "Oh, welcome into our world of alcohol," and it's, although it's covering up some of the alcohol, it's almost inviting you to go in and explore the different options.
Yes, I know Sheila Gilheany has got some very strong views on this, and also the use of alibi marketing for no products as well, or no products outside of those areas, which does seem to undermine the policy intent. Okay, thank you very much. Someone called Wayne, but I didn't see your surname, sorry, has got a question around causal models, which is something that maybe, oh, it's Wayne Galt, hello. If you would like to ask your question, that would be great.
Yeah, thank you, Eleanor. Yeah, I've been around this area working with licensing boards for a very long time, and the older I get, the more I realise what an appalling task they have before them in terms of lots of different competing interests. And we've really struggled as a profession to persuade or influence our licensing boards effectively. And I suspect one of the reasons for that is that they're trying to balance the pain of any potential policy change, restricting availability or incurring the wrath of large retail outlets with rich silvery-tongued lawyers at their disposal, with the confidence that they might need to endure that pain that the proposed change will have the impact that we argue that it would have. And we've not been particularly good at that as a discipline. You contrast that with the kind of policy changes around minimum unit pricing, for example. We were able to demonstrate, or the academic world was able to demonstrate, some pretty compelling structural models that demonstrated the impact that such and such an increase in minimum unit pricing would have on alcohol harm and such like. We've not been able to do that in terms of the availability arguments. So simple things like, effect size. Elena mentioned at the beginning that there's 17,000 alcohol outlets in Scotland. I can't remember how many applications there are per year, probably about a couple of thousand. And in total, for the whole of Scotland, there might be a dozen outlets are refused a license. So even where we were really successful in achieving sort of policy changes, to what extent would the effect change, or to what extent would the effect have an impact that we want it to have? So I think as a profession, we really need to get much better at and having confidence or generating confidence about our understanding of the kind of causal models that are out there, not just the causal pathways, but also, what are the confounders? So some of the arguments that we're making about the relationship between X and Y, are those relationships true? Or are those just simply statistical relationships because of some third party confounding effect? So I guess my question was, Elena, given the work that you've done, do you feel that some of the insights that you've been able to gather helps contribute to what these causal models might look like?
Yeah, that's really good observations and a good question. And I feel like a lot of the stuff coming out of our quantitative packages will shed a lot of light into changes in availability over time and how they've changed in areas of multiple deprivation in urban and rural areas, and how this links to population health. And some of these will then be explained by the data we're getting in the focus groups as well. Although I can't obviously say much about these. Hopefully it will be feeding into this and shedding some light into understanding how availability might be shaping perceptions and behaviours as well.
Okay, thank you.
Can I ask just a follow-up question to all the kind of academics in the audience? Is anyone aware of a relatively recent publication anywhere that tries to synthesize, apologies for the jargon, a DAG, a direct cyclic graph, a causal model for how we think all the different contributing factors contribute towards alcohol-related harm? I've not seen one.
Well, shall I leave that if anyone is aware of anything like that? If you could share it with me or one of the SHAAP team afterwards, and then we'll share it with you, Wayne, and anyone else who might be interested. Okay, thank you very much. I think, well, we're coming close to time, and I just wanted to draw everyone's attention to some of the really helpful, or they look like they're going to be really useful links that have been posted into the chat to pieces of research and seminars and things. So I think if you've got chance just before we finish up to have a look through and see if any of that would be useful, because it looks really interesting. I think learning from other countries is quite critical for this. So thank you. So, and then there's a couple of other points have been made, but I don't think we've got any more burning questions. So Elena, can I just ask one final question, which is around just using, abusing my position as chair, which is about other harmful products as well. And I suppose cuts back to what we were talking about earlier in terms of asking for small change versus large scale change and what's the most effective approach. But it seems to me that obviously tobacco is included within this wider study that you've been involved in. But there's also, that we'll have counterparts that work in high fat, salt, sugar food sort of fields, and there's also potentially people who work within gambling who would like to see harms caused by gambling reduced. And I think there's availability arguments will be very common across all of those products. I mean, as a non-academic, I can just make these assertions, but I wonder if what you think, if any of these other products have come up, but also if you think there is scope for these various different products, all or organisations who work to reduce harms from these products to all work together, and if there would then be a sort of policy, political appetite to listen at that very, very sort of, I guess, cross-cutting level to try and create healthier environments that reduce availability of all these products.
So we didn't specifically ask about these. We try to keep it focused on alcohol and tobacco, but the key experts did talk about healthy environments more generally. Some of them talked about urban planning and how we can create environments that are actually pushing people into healthier choices rather than unhealthy. And yeah, they did mention gambling. Gambling was betting shops were mentioned as well. And the NCD Alliance and all of the work they do in terms of addressing availability across all of the unhealthy commodities. In terms of the public, vaping came up a lot because people talked about, yeah, it's great with reduced smoking, but look what happened with vaping. And again, this something we didn't want to discuss in detail, but it did keep coming up about, I suppose, consequences of one policy affecting something else. And the public did talk about this.
Yeah.
So, but yeah.
Yeah, okay. Well, that's been really interesting. So thank you so much, Elena, for a really interesting presentation. And I think you've whetted all our appetites for all the research we publish now. I'm really looking forward to it because I think it will be incredibly helpful for us as advocates and for policymakers and for everyone involved in the field at a local or national level. So really looking forward to seeing the results. So thank you very, very much.
Thank you.
Thank you to everyone for coming today, and thank you for your questions and points of view. It's really good to hear them, and it is really helpful to hear from perspectives from other countries in particular. That's what I love about these occasionals. So thank you very, very much. Our next occasional is going to take place on Wednesday, the 24th of May. And this one we'll be hearing from David Whiteley about alcohol marketing to LGBTQ plus people. So that will be a really interesting topic. So yeah, Jodie has just posted in the chat the link to that. If you're interested, please do register or share away as well. But look forward to seeing you at that occasional, I hope. And thank you very, very much for coming today. And thank you, Elena, in particular.